So if you've been around the music production YouTube tutorial block for a while, you've probably noticed that there seem to be two different ways of setting up plugins like reverbs and delays inside of your DAW. The first way is the obvious direct insert approach. This is just where you grab a plugin and you insert it directly on the track, and then you adjust the mix or the dry wet knob to taste. And the second way you've probably seen is by method of what's called a return track. Now, this might be called an aux track or an effects channel. The precise terminology does vary depending on the DAW you're using, but the concept is universal. Now for this approach, unlike the direct insert approach, you actually create a standalone return track with that plugin on it, most commonly a reverb or a delay. You set the mix at 100%, and then you use what are called sends to send any desired amount of the dry original track through that effect on the return track. So here's how you could think about the difference between these two approaches. The direct insert approach is sort of like when you have a piece of cake and then you put ice cream directly on top of that piece of cake, versus putting a plugin on a return track and then sending your dry track through it is like having both the cake and the ice cream, but they're on different plates. Now in both cases, you still end up eating both, but there are some differences between the two approaches. Some of it will inevitably just be personal preference, but there are instances where one approach really does taste better than the other. So what are the advantages of either approach? Like, when should you use a return track versus a direct insert? And finally, there's a sneaky third way to do this that does not get talked about enough that I'm going to include in this video as well. So be sure to stick around with that because it is going to be an immensely valuable tool for you to add to your toolbox. So the first approach we're going to look at here is the most common way of adding plugins to your tracks, and that is as a direct insert. So there are two main instances. You could also think of this as the two core advantages to using a direct insert. The first instance would be when you know that the track that you're adding the plugin to, you really want to drench that track in the effect. It's almost like the effect is going to have more of an effect on the sound than the original dry signal is, right? So if you want it to be a really washy sound or a super delayed sound, then you can often just put that as a direct insert on the track. And as you can see here, this would be a great example of just using a reverb as a direct insert because the mix is at almost 50%. And then the second instance is just when you want to keep things as simple as possible. And if you're just starting out or if you haven't really produced that much yet, then this is definitely a way to keep things simple from the start. And you just want a more easy to comprehend and easy to navigate session, then by all means, there's nothing wrong with using plugins like reverbs and delays and putting them directly on the track and then just adjusting the dry wet knob. It's the most basic form of adding plugins, but there are some limitations to it, and that is why we do have the other two options, which we will get into right now. Now, the second way to do this is, of course, using a return track. So very quickly, I'm going to set up a return track here, which in Studio One, they're called effects channels. So you can just add an effects channel. And then in this case, I'm going to add a delay plugin. So I'm going to add Valhalla Delay. Now, a key point here is whenever you have a plugin on a return track is the mix has to be at 100%, or there's just no reason for the mix not to be at 100%. And so we got the mix at 100%. And now what you can do, I'm going to mark this as our delay. You can come over here to the vocal and underneath the sends area here, hit plus, and there's that effects channel. There's that return track delay popping up. And now we're sending this track to that delay. So I'm going to turn off this reverb for now that we have inserted on the track from the first step. And let's see what we got. And then as you can see here, you can adjust how much of this dry track that we want to send to this delay. So this is sort of like a mix knob, except we're not really affecting the initial dry signal. So that remains constant. And that is one of the advantages to this is your initial dry signal stays the same. And then you have on an independent channel, that is where your delay or your reverb is living. And that allows each element, both the dry and the wet signal, to have their own lanes. And this goes back to the example I talked about, where it's like a return track is like having both your cake and your ice cream, but they're on different plates instead of directly on top of each other. Okay, now there are three main advantages to using a return track instead of a direct insert. And the first one is it allows you to send multiple tracks to just one instance of, for example, a reverb. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set up another return track here. And this time, in order to expedite the process, if you're using Studio One, this is a cool little trick you can do, is just drag the plugin and pull it into the sends area, and then when you do that, it automatically creates that return track over here. So now we want to make sure that the mix is at 100%, then turn it on, and now as you can see here, we've got that return track here, and we're sending the vocal to it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this from there, from the insert. So now we have that reverb on a return track, and we're sending the vocal to it. Right? Now what this allows us to do is, since we now have that reverb, and let's say that is the core reverb, you know that you want to use that probably across multiple tracks, like your guitars and your background vocals and your drums even, you might want to send multiple things to it. Well, instead of using that same preset and that same plugin and inserting it on all those tracks, let's say that you would do that 10 times across 10 tracks, well, that is 10 times the CPU space that is going to take up. So this conserves CPU in such a dramatic way, because now you have only one instance of a reverb on a return track, and now you can send as many things as you want to through it. So if you come over to this guitar loop here, I can send it to the reverb. And it doesn't take up any more CPU space. And so even just on the CPU level, it is a game changer, and it's a great idea, even if that's the only thing. But it's not just that, it also simplifies the mixing process and the production process, because now you don't have 15 different reverb plugins on all these individual tracks. Instead, you have your core reverb on a return track, and it's only one instance of it. And again, you can send as many of the tracks through that reverb as you like. Now, the second advantage to using a return track instead of a direct insert is it gives you more precise control over the affected signal. So this goes back to that silly example again, where you have the cake and the ice cream, but they're on separate plates. What this does is it allows you to really customize the ice cream without affecting the cake. And when you have your, for example here, your reverb on a return track, we can now affect that reverb signal in isolation. So let me give you an example. Let's add a flanger to this chain here on this return track. So now what we have is a reverb signal that has flanger on it. So let's listen to what that sounds like. Right, there's some modulation going on there. Let's try something else. Let's try like a phaser. So it's an even more audible version of it. Yeah, that's over the top. But as you can hear there, the original vocal signal is not being affected. The dry signal is staying exactly the same. But we are affecting the reverb signal by adding more plugins to it. And I'll give you one more example, because this is probably my favorite way to do this, is if I have a reverb, I love to add a little bit of OTT. This is a free plugin. And I'll turn the depth down to about 20 to 30%. And this just gives that reverb signal some extra crispiness and it helps it to really be heard a little bit better in the mix. Right? So here's without it. Here's with it. It takes away some of that muddiness, it cleans it up, and it brightens it up a little bit too. So that's just a nice little trick. As you can see here, we're customizing that reverb signal, that affected signal in isolation, and this dry vocal track over here, that is staying unaffected. And then finally, the third advantage, and this is connected to number 2, is whenever you want to use sidechain compression, or you could just think of this as ducking, whenever you want the reverb or the delay to duck out of the way. So for this, let's come back to the or to the delay in this case, and let's turn down this reverb a bit, and let's focus in on this delay signal. So let's hear this. And now let's grab a compressor. So I'm just going to grab my stock compressor inside of Studio One here, and we are going to sidechain this to that lead vocal. So I click sidechain. We're going to sidechain this to the vocal. What a sidechain compressor does is it shoots down the volume of the track that it is inserted on, which is, in this case, this compressor is on that delay signal. It's on that delay return track. So now what's happening is whenever the vocal is singing, that compressor shoots down the delay. It ducks the delay. And then as soon as a vocal line is completed, the delay comes back to full volume. That way, the delay doesn't fight with that main dry lead vocal. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Let's come over here. Turn down that threshold. As you can see here, we're ducking it. And you can hear it, right? There's an extreme version of it. So you can go as extreme as you want with that, obviously. You can go as subtle as you want. But that is another advantage of having return tracks where you can, again, this is very much connected with the second point I made, or the advantage of it allows you to customize that isolated affected signal. And sidechain compression is just another example of it. It allows you to duck it out of the way so that you can create a more transparent mix that makes sense, that is more balanced. Now, as promised, we still have that third approach to get to. This is the sneaky one, and this is one that's really fun. However, before we do that, just very quickly, I want to let you know that I do have my vocal EQ and compression guide. I'll talk more about this at the end of the video, but all you need to know is this gives you a systematic, a visual structure and an understanding of how to fix problems with EQ and how to compress your vocals in a way that makes sense, that is repeatable, that really glues your vocal together and gives you a really solid compressed sound every time. So I'll leave a link in the description below. It's 100% free, so check that out if you're interested. So the third approach to adding reverbs and delays into your DAW is by using what's called a parallel track. Now, this is a little different than using a return track, although there are some overlapping components to it. So this is very simple. All you do is you duplicate the track that you're trying to add the effect to. So I'm going to come over here, duplicate track complete, because you want to duplicate the track and everything on it. So now we have two different versions of the exact same track. Now let's take this duplicated track and we are going to add an effect to it. So first, let's just remove all the sends. That way we start completely dry. Now what we want to do is let's just add a reverb to this effect. Actually, no, let's add a delay, because there's some cool things you can do when you add a delay in this case. So just like a return track, you want that mix to be at 100%, because we now have our dry signal and our wet delay signal here. So now, up to this point, this is basically exactly the same as using a return track. You've got the dry signal and the delay signal. But the advantage of using a parallel track is it gives you more visual control over it, because now you have actual audio where instead of having to use automation lanes and stuff like that, you can see exactly what the audio looks like. So if you come here, you can just be like, okay, I only want the delay here, so I'm gonna cut that out, and you can just very quickly do things like this. Where you can add in those delay throws on this affected track here. So by using a parallel track, as you can see, it gives you that extra flexibility to just rearrange the audio if you want to. You can move this over here. You can even, so let me actually try one more random thing. I'm gonna throw in Little Altar Boy and I'm gonna put it before the delay because that's the only way that's gonna work correctly. And then I'm gonna format this down. I just want to see how this sounds. Right? And then maybe we could come into this delay and really filter out those highs. And then you have a monster delay sound because this parallel track, again, you're running it through that altar boy, but then that is going through a delay that is at 100% mix. So you're not even getting any of the dry, even altar boy sound. And then that altar boy gets sent through 100% mix on this delay. And that is how you get that combination. Just really cool. So there you go. Thank you so much for watching this video. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to dive deeper into vocal EQ and compression, then be sure to download my free guide. I'll leave a link in the description below. It is the vocal EQ and compression guide. This will help you fix problems with vocal EQ in a visual way. You can see exactly visually what the cuts or the boost should look like depending on what your specific problems are with your vocals. And the same goes for compression. It is the vocal EQ and compression guide. Link again in the description. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope this gave you some clarity. I hope this was valuable to you. So if it was, let me know in the comments what other videos that or what other problems rather that you're struggling with and that you would like me to do a video on. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you next time.